Hey, folks. Hello. Hey, everyone. So one request, if we could try and sit in the center of the row so people who arrive late can fit in the edges. Also, let's all welcome Amber Brown, who's talking about how we do identity wrong.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? All good? Great. So, I am Amber Hawkey Brown, computer owl, teen lover. On the Angry Bird website, you can find me at HawkOwl. I hail from Melbourne, Australia, and my website is leastfornow.net if you want to find me. So, what is identity? Who even knows? The identity of a person is the characteristics they have that distinguish them from others. This is composed of internal and external attributes. Generally, your internal attributes are relatively unchangeable. They are things like your personality, your gender, and your life experience. But external attributes tend to change more. Things like your address, especially if you're a millennial and you move every year like me. Your birth date. Now, sometimes there's some wacky things that happen with that, especially if you're old and were born before computerized birth certificates. Some people don't know their birth dates. Your nationality might change. You might move to a different country. You might become a citizen of somewhere else. The country of your birth might cease to exist and form into another. Your name can also change throughout your life, as well as some things that people think that stay relatively static, like your social security number and your Medicare number. But we as developers, we need to sometimes know information about users. So what do we generally store? Name and address is pretty common if you're sending people anything. Date of birth, it's important to know that maybe your users are old enough to see such content or sign contracts or do other sorts of things that your website might want to do. Then nationality, sometimes you need to record that in case, like, for example, you are the United States ESTA. You need to know what country someone's passport is from. Their gender, possibly, we store that a lot. Their social security number or Medicare number for looking up in government systems, and other sorts of small attributes like that. Now, which of these is immutable? None of them, really, unfortunately. Reality doesn't really fit in well-defined boxes, and we as software developers love finely defined boxes. It's great if most things can fit in a single row in a database and never change, and not have issues that wake you up at 3 a.m. where suddenly it's someone with a Unicode name types in their name in Unicode, and then suddenly your website falls over. Let's tackle the problem of names. We screw these up a lot. Now, most Anglo countries, such as England and Australia and the United States, will generally format a name like this. You'll have a title or honorific, such as doctor, professor, a given name, like for example, my name is Amber. My middle name, which is Hawkey, my family name, which is Brown, and post-nominal titles, for example, PhD or MD or something like that, which I don't have because I'm uneducated. Here is someone that a lot of us should know that very well fits these boxes. Lady Augusta Ada Kingnall, Countess of Lovelace. But sometimes we miss portions of this, like Sir John Major, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He does not have a middle name. President Harry S. Truman of the United States. Some people might know this, but his middle name is actually S. That's it. So, you obviously can't rely on a middle name that exists being longer than one character. Now there's the Germans. This is a real person, and they have no less than 7 middle names, as well as 4 words in their family name. Now, a lot of things kind of trip up on that. They don't expect you to have spaces in your last name, and a lot of things don't even handle hyphens, which is funny, considering that a lot of people have hyphens in their last names. You'd think we'd be okay at that. And then there's someone like Sher. Sher's legal name is just Sher, a single given name. Can Sher use your website? I'm guessing no. And this is just the Anglo way of sending things. In other places, it works completely different. In Chinese and quite commonly Japanese, the family name comes first and the given name comes after. So you can't automatically assume that whatever the first part is someone's given name, and whatever the last part is their family name. So if you're given just a string of words that is someone's name, you can't automatically split it up into the different sections without them explicitly doing it themselves. Now, there's a lot of common naming assumptions that we have, and it's covered elsewhere, but people's names having multiple components or not having spaces or hyphens, people assuming that the name that is on your driver's license or your passport is the name that you actually use in day-to-day life, that people having one and only one middle name, that people prefer that their given name is the name that you call them, people assuming that names don't change, or that people have a single name that they go by. Now, some people who are married may go by their maiden name in some professional contexts, while using their new married name in other contexts. You can't assume that they might not want to use both. Now, names are mutable. Marriage is one of the most common reasons, changing your last name, sometimes taking one of the other partner's family name, or both partners changing their family name to a conjoined family name. Gender transition is also a common reason, as well as witness protection, and some people just don't like the name that they were given at birth. And how do we store them? Now, we need to think of the application and the reasons why we're storing them. Now, usually it's because we're either referencing some sort of government system. For example, if you are a medical institution, you quite often need to use the name there's on someone's Medicare documentation. Or you're like a social service and you have a more casual use of someone's name. It doesn't necessarily have to match up exactly to what the government says. Or some services, it's important to have both, because you might want to have a user have a more, a preferred name, while also having in the background their name verified by some sort of government institution. Now, if you are dealing with government departments, it is simply just best to use the schema that the government uses. Even if this schema is wrong, it is unfortunately one that will match up consistently with their systems, and it's likely that the person, if their name doesn't fit with their regular government systems, will know how to get around it. But it is also good to use a single field for casual uses, such as the person that you're sending a letter to. You don't need to break that up into first name and last name and all of that sort of stuff. It just gets printed right on the label. If you do need to ask for multiple names, it's best to minimize confusion and make it clear what is used where, making it clear that this section is what is for your government ID and this section is what we will call you when you're going around the website. And often, if you want to ask for both, you could always just ask for the government ID first, and then have an option, is your name different than what is on your ID? Click here, and then it shows the rest of the options to enter their preferred details. And don't assume that, given a name, that you can extract out portions of it. You must ask for this if you need it. For example, my boarding pass was for someone called Amber Hawkey. One word. Doesn't quite match what's on my passport, to be honest. There is this classic article which goes into a bit more detail about the falsehoods that programmers believe about names. It's a very worthwhile read. You can just Google falsehood programmers believe about names and you'll find it. There'll also be slides posted up afterwards for a nice clickable link. Let's tackle gender. Now, this is an interesting one. The first question I ask is, what are you going to use the information for? Why are you asking? Do you actually want to ask for pronouns to refer to someone throughout your website? Or do you want to know if they're interested in gendered products, such as, tampons or pregnancy tests or that sort of thing? Usually, you only really care about pronouns. So you want to offer common pronouns. You want to allow custom ones as well. You don't want to show this information publicly by default. You should leave it up to the user to decide whether they want to let that be known to just any random passerby. And do you actually need to use pronouns in your website after all? Usually you can avoid it. But if you're asking about gender, there's sometimes legitimate reasons where you would want to ask. For example, verifying things against Medicare and My Passport is a legitimate use. Sometimes collecting information for programs focused on gender minorities is important to know that they qualify. And statistical information, for example, a lot of conferences will ask your gender for working out demographics, to working out how well certain outreach efforts are going. And if you must do this, it's best to use a free-form text box or a drop-down box that allows you to then type in another option. Fits everyone, doesn't have much more work, and keeps everyone happy. Now, addresses. Now, the non-Americans in here will probably be nodding quite a bit. Now, things that don't exist outside of America, zip codes are a big thing. Counties, and Arizona. If I select Australia, please do not let me select Arizona as the state. This has happened. Thankfully, the Australian Post Office is kind of pretty good with working that out. But things that do exist outside of the United States. PO boxes in Australia, for example, commonly accept packages. And in a lot of cases, this is the only way you can get a package delivered if you're in a rural place. So simply going, if it's got PO box in it, can't deliver packages, isn't quite accurate if you're working in places other than where you know. Postcodes can sometimes have letters in them. For example, the UK. The Brit in the front row is nodding. Also extremely long town or city names, and especially ones with spaces like you'll get in Germany. Sometimes an address isn't a thing that exists at all in some places. This is a letter that was successfully delivered. Recently there was a story where someone sent a letter labeled simply England, and it made its way to its destination. Foreign post services sometimes know how to get a letter places better than you do. Now, this is commonly what happens in the US. You have address line 1, address line 2, a city, a postcode or a zip code, and the country. Now, this fits for a lot of places, but for example, doesn't fit some places like the UK, or sometimes doesn't match where you're trying to interpret things about the address. It's best to research into the country that you're planning to deliver services to and match the address lines correctly for there. And even then, sometimes you might just have to have a big text box where they can just write things in. Generally, the post service will get things to where they are needed. There's also a falsehood programmers believe about addresses, which is very UK-focused and has a lot of interesting facts, some of which I didn't know. And it turns out that the UK, I'm surprised mail gets anywhere at all. I'm surprised mail gets anywhere in Australia, that the trucks don't just, disappear in the Nullarbor. But anyway. Now, whenever you're storing personal information or asking for it, there are dangers and extreme pitfalls. Greg Doctorow once said, "We should treat personal electronic data with the same care and respect as weapons-grade plutonium. It is dangerous, long-lasting, and once it is leaked, there is no way of getting it back." And this is a generally correct assumption. Those that have lived through the Equifax leak of 2015 or 2016, whenever it was, will know that once that information is in the public domain, there's no way of getting it back. And for a lot of people, that's information that they can't easily change. They can't easily change their social security number, even if they might be able to. Getting every single person in America to change this information to prevent themselves being defrauded is an unaskable task. Now, if you screw up and data does get leaked, especially personal data, under the new General Data Protection Regulations, there are sanctions of a fine of up to 20 million euros, or up to 4% of the annual worldwide turnover of the preceding financial year of a case of an enterprise, whichever is greater if there has been an infringement. So that makes leaks of personal data not only something that is bad for your PR, but also bad for your wallet. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be very hard to protect some sensitive information. Have I Been Pawned is a website that has that allows you to check just your email address, not other information, but your email address, among 283 websites that have had information leaked. That ends up being over 5 billion accounts, and probably hundreds of millions of people. Some of these websites that have been hacked leak more than just names and email addresses and hashed passwords. One of these people that got hacked was the Qatar National Bank. And that includes all the information their bank needs to verify that you are a real person. And when they have that much information, a hacker who has this information has enough to verify that you are genuine to basically anywhere else in the world. When you have information such as this that is incorrectly handled, it can cause the financial burdens of hundreds of thousands of people at a grand scale. So if you don't need the information, don't store it. Don't keep it. It also means that if the worst were to come to happen and, say, some fascist party came to power in some country and they started wanting information that could be used to track down everyone of a particular nationality or ethnicity or opinion. If you don't keep extraneous information that has that, it means that you are doing a good thing. And especially in the days of this current climate, collecting mass amounts of user data can be a bad thing. So think of what could happen if the data is not hacked, but is simply subpoenaed by some government. Now, we have consequences of our actions of the collective, of individual people. We're simply not living in a vacuum where we have a website and data happens on it, and sometimes we might get fined if data gets leaked and all of that, but this does have effects on individual people. Because at the end of the day, you are dealing with individual people. They have feelings, they have aspirations, they have daily struggles. And your software should be made to help them. Maybe it might not help all of these, but at the end of the day, software does not have a point if it does not help people, or at least simplify some other task that in the end helps people. Even if doing your taxes online doesn't really help you, it helps society as a whole. Now, in a lot of places now, software is non-optional. You cannot opt out of using some software. For example, banks nowadays, when you want to do simple tasks, will say, log onto our website, use that instead. Services such as MyGov in Australia have a lot of information and allow you to do a lot of things with the federal government. And a lot of them now basically must be done online. Even if you go into their offices, they will show you to an iPad where you can then log in. You simply cannot say that, no, I won't worry about this because people are choosing to use my software. That's not the case, even with, for example, Facebook. For a lot of people, it is not socially possible to opt out of some social networks, especially in rural towns where it might be the only way of communicating with some people. Now, when you're in a situation, especially a situation where everything is very social and not just interacting with the government, denying a person their identity is denying them their humanity. By making it so that someone cannot be their authentic self in your software or on your platform, you are making them lesser of a user than everyone else. And this can lead to people being excluded, lead them to be feeling marginalized, and having them be upset. And ultimately, your software should not do that. The golden rules are to not make assumptions. If you're going into a new market, then you need to ask questions about it. You need to do a lot more research. You need to figure out how names are common in that jurisdiction. You need to figure out how addresses work. You need to make sure that when someone goes to use your service or use your website, that they are actually able to do it in the least frustrating way as possible, because ultimately you want users to use your website, don't you? Don't think that people are like you. Even though I personally have a name that works on many sites, and I have a binary gender, so I can simply select female, not everyone is fortunate enough to be able to have that privilege. So don't think you'll get it right the first time. Talk to people. Do your research. Make sure that you can change things later on if someone comes to you with a problem. Don't be the company that says, no, our services can't support a single name. It's simply not possible. You just have to put A in the last name box. And the best way to do that is by thinking ahead. When you are designing a system, you can commonly it goes where you have to have some sort of identity in your system. For Django, you simply just use the user model. Now, the Django user model is broken because it asks for first and last name. And this does not work in a lot of international communities. So you have to come up with your own schema. And you have to come up with a schema that is as flexible as possible to allow future changes, to allow you to move into other markets or other jurisdictions, and to do it without potentially breaking all of your software. A good idea to think about is making all of your systems Unicode aware. Even if you don't think that it will be a problem, making sure that every part of your system, from the login form to every entry on your website, to the emails that it sends out, make sure that it formats names correctly. Make sure that it doesn't mangle them. Because it's very, very, very bad when you get an email with emoji bake instead of a name. Not only does it make the person roll their eyes, it also reduces their confidence in you as a website, as a service, as a company, because you can't even get their name right. This is basically it. We started a bit early, which is good. I was going to have questions in the hall, but we've got 5 minutes. 8 minutes. 8 whole minutes. Which is good, so I might do some Q&A. Now, for Q&A, I'd like to keep it to questions. So, yes, thank you. I'll do it. Yeah, that'll be fine.
So I have a quick question. I am working with
I don't know where you are.
I'm
Sorry.
here.
Oh, hello. Hello.
I'm working with a database I didn't design that uses foreign keys quite a bit.
Okay.
And one of the things it does is it links people records via a foreign key to the district that they represent. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
So the issue is, for whatever reason, there are floating people records in the people table. Yeah.
What people?
There are floating person records. In other words, they're not linked with a foreign key.
Okay. Yes.
So I'm wondering if there are database structures or strategies that you could, or have you ever run into this, that you could recommend to avoid what I'm calling floating people records, right?
So database integrity, especially when it comes to handling with people, basically, yeah, it's just a lot of verifying things at several stages. And yeah, so when you've got users that have incomplete information and they're just floating, it's a good idea to figure out how that happened, obviously, and to strengthen your database constraints so it can't happen again. Now, there's not really a database structure or so that can stop this. It's kind of just incorrect database integrity. But There's also the case where, for example, you might have people who represent a jurisdiction. So you can have that as a separate table that links it there. So then you move the relation over, which allows for people to represent multiple districts, but that's probably not a realistic case. But essentially, making sure that your database will not allow that to happen comes a long way, because then when these sort of problems come up, they sort of hard fail instead of suddenly, oh no, a bunch of people don't have things and they slip through the gaps. So yeah, sorry, I can't be more helpful. Andrew.
So one of the things you had in your earlier slides with the list of parts of identity was age and date of birth in particular.
Yes.
I have had problems with this in the past. Do you have a suggested way of storing age, especially in the fuzzy sense, in databases?
So there's actually something that's happened in Australia that does this. Now, I forget exactly what it's called, but there is something in the Australian archives where they have multiple hundred years of information. And they have come up with a schema that is sort of very fuzzy for dates of birth. So it can say, for example, it can say that this person was born on, say, for example, my one is December 7th, 1993. Sorry, what? Yep. Sam will post a link on Twitter to the talk. But basically, it can do like a day, it could say a month. You can say, we know they was born in between these dates. He was born this year, he was born maybe this year, or this range of years. So there are solutions to this, to a sort of a standard schema of encoding very fuzzy dates of birth. And I mean, also there have been cases where clerical errors have meant that it also changes in the future, so not having a read-only is good. But yes, Sam will be able to hook you up with the talk on that. But there are archivists have had to come up with ways of representing incomplete dates of birth, especially when you've got Australian history where people were born out in the country and they don't know how old they are, no one knows how old they are, but they remember that they were born in the spring.
Great, thank you.
Hi, do you know a good third-party solution that will basically give me an iframe with a bunch of address inputs and name inputs and give me a user token that I can just pull data from whenever I need it?
Not particularly. Unfortunately, a lot of these things you've kind of got to bake yourself. And it kind of can wrap into other identity systems, especially ones like authentication systems. Like generally, people like bundling their authentication identity with their user identity and sort of there. But unfortunately, I don't think there's many off-the-shelf options. I mean, the closest you get is like Django, but unfortunately, Django's wrong. So it's basically just coming up with a set of things and just having to deal with it yourself, which is unfortunate. But as time goes on, a lot more web frameworks and things will come with more correct things as default, so then it's not you re-implementing everything. But as of right now, there is no nice, here's a service that will take care of how complicated humans are and let me ask nice questions of it. It's maybe a good startup idea if you are in Europe, because that's a thing that comes up plenty.
Thanks. Hi. A short question. Have you seen this executed well? Do you have any examples that you think did a good job with this?
So I've seen where some things execute some things well, and then they also screw up the rest of it. So Facebook, for example, does gender pretty well. It allows you to enter common ones as well as custom ones. But then they have their real name policy, where they say that people's names in the community, for example, are not valid because they do not match their government ID. And this is commonly comes into play when you have people that are acting under a pseudonym or go by another name that they prefer, and Facebook goes, oh, no, that's not right. So Facebook is an example of doing one thing correct and then doing the other thing horribly wrong. Unfortunately, I haven't seen anything that universally does everything right, but I have seen a lot of services that do it right in that they don't ask for more information than they need to do the exact job that they need to do. Now, when you have things that ask for a load of information, they're of course going to probably get something wrong, unless they have a very diverse team that can think of all these things, but generally they can't. But the team that decides we don't need this information, it's completely superfluous, we can just get rid of it, is less likely to make those mistakes. So I'd say it's been done well, where people have just not asked. And that's probably the best way for a lot of things. Your Uber for dogs doesn't need my gender. Thank you. Yes, I think we've still got 1 minute, so you have 1 minute.
You talked about using addresses for sending mail.
Yes.
And I'm wondering about suggestions for other uses of addresses, like finding people near you physically. In particular, the balance of asking people versus using automated methods.
So using automated methods is almost universally unethical, unless they've opted into it. In which case you can get away with things such as very fuzzy GPS coordinates. You can fuzz that, and that, you know, if you use too fine of a one, then it's like the house, but you can like go within a city block. So generally, it's better for that sort of near me thing to use those sorts of coordinates versus an address, because, for example, in Australia, you have some cases where an address will be a 100-acre plot of land. And it's like, oh, yeah, this is just next door. And it's like, great, but it's 20 Ks down the road. So, yeah, it's better to use GPS addresses for the near-me sort of things, but also keeping it constrained enough that it's not within like 20 or 30 meters just by cutting things off. And that's generally more, not anonymous, but less exactly identifying than addresses anyway. Which also things like Uber can't even do right. They sometimes, like, it's very exact, but sometimes it's very unexact. So while the GPS address has a known level of exactness. Thank you very much for those people that came out the trek out here, and I'll see you at Sprints.